The British pop scene in 1965 was exploding into several different directions, and the differences between the mods and the rockers started to blur as the music industry shifted into this hippie psychedelic phase. Now, at the forefront of the mod movement were the Small Faces. We're going to learn about their history here on Pop Goes the 60s. If you ask me about my favorite British bands of the 60s, of course the Beatles are way up there, and then I got the Stones. I love the Kinks and the Hollies, but one of my all-time favorites are the Small Faces. And our story begins in London. Steve Marriot was a street musician and child actor, and his parents continued to push him into acting, and he indeed got several roles, culminating with a role in Oliver, the stage production of Oliver in 1960. Now, he had also formed a band called The Wheels, so he always was doing both music and acting. The Oliver show, he was in that for 12 months, and he played several different boy roles, but he sang the Artful Dodger parts on 3 or 4 songs on the album. And the official album to the stage show was released by World Record Club and recorded at Abbey Road Studios. Because of this success, he continued to pursue an acting career, which his parents loved, usually playing like a Cockney lad and roles like that. But a couple years later, when he shot the film Live It Up, he had a small role. This was a film also with David Hemmings, but it had a musical background. It was here he decided that he was going to pursue music full-time. And he also appeared in a Peter Sellers film called Heavens Above. That was also released in 1963. But by this time, he had already started recording. He got a recording contract with Decca Records and recorded a single written by Kenny Lynch, but the B-side was a song that Steve Marriot wrote.
Except that she's as gentle as a dove. Guess she must have come from heaven above, my imaginary love.
Now that song didn't do anything. He ended up forming another band called The Moments. And this band, they gigged around for quite a long time. They did 80 gigs in their history and played places like the Crawdaddy Club. And they did release a single. It was a cover of the Kinks' You Really Got Me.
You got me so I can't sleep at night. You really got me. You really got me. You really got me.
Now, I'm not sure how you could better the Kinks version of You Really Got Me, and that song didn't do anything. But after the failure of this single, Steve Marriot got dumped from the band. He was the youngest member of the band, and I'm not quite sure why he was dumped, but he didn't really let any grass grow under his feet at this point. He got a job with Andrew Loog Oldham's orchestra playing harmonica. Steve Marriot was itching to get into another band, and he had seen a couple guys play, a guy named Kenney Jones and Ronnie Lane playing in their respective bands. Lane and Kenney Jones actually worked at Selmer's Music. Now, Selmer's Music was known more for who they sold their guitars to. They sold guitars to John McLaughlin, Jimmy Page, Jeff Beck, Eric Clapton. But Steve Marriot worked at a rival store called The Music Bar. And Ronnie Lane came in there one day with his father, and his father bought him a bass guitar. And they got to know each other, and after that meeting, he went over to Steve Marriot's house and he listened to records, and they formed a band immediately thereafter. They quickly added Kenney Jones on drums and brought in Jimmy Winston for rhythm guitar and organ. Now, Winston also had a truck, so he was very valuable to them in schlepping all their gear around. So they started to perform as the Small Faces. Now, the name the Small Faces, there's a couple different stories, but a friend of theirs, a girl, had noticed that they were all small guys. They were like 5'6" and just kind of slight guys. Save for Jimmy Winston. Winston was a little bit taller, so he didn't quite have the look, but that Small Faces name that this girl came up with caught on. And the term face, being a face on the scene, was kind of in that whole mod thing anyway, so it was a good name for the times. After rehearsing for some time, they had their first public gig in June of 1965. And I keep talking about this mod scene, and what the mod music scene was at the time. There's really couple components to it. Fashion of people that were mods was high fashion. It was sporty clothes, sharp haircuts, and they were riding these scooters around. But the music in the clubs they were dancing to was R&B. So mod music didn't really exist. It was just R&B music that they danced to, and they loved American R&B. And the clubs were just hives for dancing and for high energy bands. And the Small Faces, their early gigs, they did a couple shows for like some working man clubs that they didn't go over well at all. But then they found some more mod clubs where people are dancing to this R&B music, which is exactly what they were doing. And those are the places they got hired, and they quickly built a following. A couple new bands on the scene playing what was now like newer mod music. British bands that were starting to write some of their own music or play American R&B were not only the Small Faces, but the Byrds, the British Byrds, featuring Ronnie Wood, and also the Action. So these are the early mod bands that were around. The Who was around at the time, but they weren't considered as much of a mod band as the other bands. As I said earlier, the music scene was exploding in London, and there was always people around looking for talent. And Don Arden was a manager looking around for bands, and he found the Small Faces, and he signed them. He signed them like right away. Now the band, they were all under 21, so their parents had to come with them and sign. And Arden at the time, he had a little bit of a reputation as being kind of a tough guy. Yeah, retrospectively, he's called kind of gangster-like, but he was managing a lot of different things at the time, and the first thing he did was put them on salary, so they started making some steady money, and he got them accounts at all the Carnaby shops, so they could deck themselves out in all the Carnaby Street finery. Little did they know of Don Arden's actual background. His reputation was actually worse than was reported originally, and other people were interested in signing the Small Faces, including Robert Stigwood, the Australian entrepreneur. And when Arden caught wind of this, the story is that he held them outside of a window on a fourth-story apartment building or something to scare Stigwood out of signing the band or something like that. So that was a warning to Stigwood, and indeed, Stigwood did not sign the Small Faces. So Arden was very enthusiastic about the band, though, and he felt that they had potential. And Steve Marriott was working on a song that he was writing that was based on a Solomon Burke song. And they didn't really have lyrics for it. So Arden realized that they needed to bring some help in, and he brought some lyricists in to do the song. What you gonna do about it?
Sing the song now. What you gonna do? What you gonna do? Tell the truth. What you gonna do?
Now, they recorded several versions of this song. All of them are pretty raw, some more raucous than others, but this single, this recording got them a contract with Decca. And Decca released it as a single, and it got to number 14 in the charts. To ensure this record was a hit, Don Arden employed some rather unscrupulous tactics, namely buying up many copies of the record. And he has admitted this. And it was not that uncommon to help get your record into the charts, to go around to several shops and buy up copies to essentially create some scarcity. But anyway, it was a great record. People responded to it. It was a great club favorite, had tons of energy. And as I said, it hit number 14. Now with the hit single on their hands, they started to get way more popular in the clubs, and they had cocky attitudes, so they were well suited to the mod scene. And this cocky attitude, I think, helped propel them to suggest that their next single be a self-composed single. And they wrote the next single. It's called I've Got Mine.
And now, just back from their fabulous American tour, the Small Faces.
I just said you what you have to say, but you use this letter.
I've Got Mine was featured in the crime film Dateline Diamonds, and the film came out a little too late for it to coincide with the release of the single. And the single bombed anyway, so they didn't get any promotion off of the film at all. And I think it's a great song. I love the song, but maybe it was a little bit too dark or didn't have enough hooks for the pop audience. They were still a big hit in the clubs, of course, and this song did well there, but it just didn't do much on the charts. Now, it wasn't long after this that they fired Jimmy Winston, and there's not really a clear reason why they fired him. There was one incident where they were doing a TV appearance and Winston was trying to get the attention of the cameraman by waving furiously, and that did not go over well with the rest of the band, particularly Marriott, who was the lead singer of the song that was being recorded. And there was other stories that, well, he didn't fit the look of the Small Faces. He was taller, but I think also what was going on is he was a little bit older, maybe indeed didn't fit in as well, but he was starting to question Arden about the money. because the band were still making their weekly salary. But as they started to grow and do bigger club dates and they had one hit single under the belt, he was starting to question management. So anyway, all this came to a head and he was ousted from the band. A guy that they did know, Ian McLagan, well, Ian McLagan knew the Small Faces for sure because they had a hit. McLagan was a keyboard player and played some guitar as well. And they had a meeting with him and he fit right in. And when Arden hired him, he was making like 10 pounds more a week than the other band members. And after a probationary period, McLagan asked to be paid the same amount as the other band members. And the other band members really respected him for that, and he was in. Winston eventually formed another band called Winston's Fums. He had a couple psychedelic singles that are well sought after, but he didn't do much other than that. Now with Winston out of the way, and with McLagan on board, they decided to do another single but bring in some other writers. The band really didn't like this song that much. It was a little bit too poppy for them, but they put their energy into it, and the song hit number 3 on the charts. So they were back on the top of the charts, and everything seemed to be restored for the time being. The next single was called Hey Girl.
Hey, hey, my, hey, hey, yeah, girl, treat me kind.
Hey Girl got to number 10, so their chart success continued, and it was time for them to do an album. So Decca brought them in and they recorded an album in 3 days. It was made up of several R&B covers and some originals.
But you played the sure one-night stand. Oh, man, a one-night stand. Yeah! I see crazy patterns every time I look your way. I can feel those crazy. I can't stop my brain from running wild, running wild, running wild. My brain.
The 3 songs you just heard were all originals, and the last one, E to D, was about amphetamine. So the band started to talk, I shouldn't say openly about drugs, but a little bit veiled drug talk within some of the songs here. Now, one of the blues covers that they did was a song called You Need Lovin'.
You need coolin'. I'm gonna send you right back to school.
That song should sound familiar to you, and most people will recognize that was the same song Zeppelin covered some years later. And a young Robert Plant was a huge Small Faces fan at the time, and he followed them around quite a lot. I believe this is where he got the arrangement from when Zeppelin did that song later. Now by August, they released their next single, the smash hit All or Nothing. All or Nothing went to number 1, and this established them as a really powerful band. And this is a self-penned song, and they were certainly at the forefront of the mod movement at this time, both on the charts and in the clubs. And the success of this song and the recording of the album allowed them to sign on to do an American tour with the Mamas and the Papas and the Lovin' Spoonful. The only problem was that whole tour got dashed when word leaked out that Ian McLagan, who had a drug bust for marijuana, that leaked out and that they had to cancel. So if anybody's keeping score, the drug busts in London in the 60s really started with Ian McLagan. Then went to Donovan, then members of the Stones, then members of the Beatles. So they did indeed work their way up. With the American tour dashed, they just did non-stop touring of England and Europe at this time. And at this point, the Beatles had stopped touring pretty much. This is summer of '66, so they weren't going to be around Europe anymore. And there was a little bit of a vacuum. The Stones were pulling back as well. So bands like The Who and the Small Faces really were the main touring bands at the time. So late in 1966, 2 more singles were released.
I sit here every day, looking at the sky, ever wondering why I dream. I can't make it without you. I can't make it without you. So open up.
My Mind's Eye hit number 4, and there was some controversy within the band over this record. It had a little bit of a Christmassy sound, so Arden wanted to push it out before Christmas. The band did not want this song as a single. And this was one of the things that led to Don Arden's dismissal Another thing that led to the removal of Arden was the money issue. Now, by this time, the band, their shows were starting to cause riots. I mean, they were very big, and they weren't seeing any additional money. That stipend that they were getting early on when they signed the contract with Arden, that is all that they got every week. It was a weekly wage. And yes, they had some charge accounts at shops, but they weren't seeing any money. So they confronted Arden. And the parents were also brought into this because the parents were also wondering. They were still under 21. And there was a big scene, and Arden accused all the band members of being on drugs, and it just got very ugly, and they just parted company with Arden. The Small Faces had won their freedom, but unfortunately the royalties from those early songs were tied up in the courts for years. The band also had an issue with Decca. Decca wanted to keep them a singles band. They weren't really into album selling, and the band started to get more creative. I mean, this is late 1966. Things are happening in London. It's swing in London. Music is changing rapidly, and the Small Faces wanted to be a part of that. And Decca's recipe for singles every couple of months just wasn't going to do it for the Small Faces, so they left Decca and signed with Andrew Loog Oldham's label Immediate. And this was a perfect signing for them because Oldham didn't really care how many singles you did, or he gave them quite a lot of freedom. And this was a really good signing for Oldham's new label. And the Small Faces became the big winners of this label and the kings of the label, really. Other smaller acts were signed, but the Small Faces were really the bread and butter. During this transition to Immediate Records, the Small Faces had been recording music for presumably the next album. And when they signed with Immediate, Decca released the tracks they had been working on with a couple of recent singles and came up with this album. This is called From the Beginning. I don't have their first album. The first album is actually from the same photo session of this, so they were in the same clothes. It's a similar photograph, actually. I actually thought I had that album, but that's how confused I got about these album covers. But From the Beginning is a interesting compilation, but I consider this part of their actual album releases. It's got a couple excellent original songs on here.
This feeling of spring, like the wing of a bird that is flying. That man and his journey's end. Mirror can tell me when the children play. They're so far away.
Those last two songs are more drug-influenced songs. That Man is a drug pusher song. This predates the Velvet Underground's I'm Waiting for the Man. Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow has that very psychedelic vibe to it. So they were really starting to push those boundaries at this early stage. Now, a couple of the songs on here weren't finished, but Arden turned them in anyway, and they got released in this compilation.
Tell me, have you ever seen me? Hey, 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 hey. I hear, I see. Part of my way of giving, and I'm giving all to you. More than love, it's a way.
We are in early 1967, and Ronnie Lane and Steve Marriott started writing the bulk of the band's material. And the first single that they wrote for Immediate was a song called Here Come the Nice.
If I need some speed, here come the night. It's understood. Here come the night. It makes you feel so good.
Although the band was still touring a lot, they started to spend more time in the studio, and their music started to take on this flower power approach. The song Here Comes the Nice is another drug pusher song. It somehow got by the censors. It may have been questioned a little bit, but that was a hit. They started to spend more time in the studio, even though they were on the road a lot, and they took this more flower power approach. And no song better encapsulates that than Itchy Coo Park.
It's all too beautiful. I feel inclined to blow my mind, guitar.
This was mainly a Ronnie Lane song, and they pushed engineer Glyn Johns to the limit by trying to get this phasing sound on the drums. So that was one of the first times we heard that so-called phasing. This is a good place to end part one. Now part two is going to pick up with the next album that the Small Faces are working on, which is much more progressive, We're going to see how they started leading the music industry into 1968. So stay tuned for that here on Pop Goes the 60s.